everyone. This is Anirban Datta, and today the GeoStrata is excited to host the G7 Strategic Roundtable to explore the critical issues around geopolitics, technology, and foreign policy. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Akshay Ranade, Assistant Professor from the Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts, Dr. Sweta Kumari, Associate Fellow from the Vivekananda India Foundation, and Dr. Raffaele Marchetti, Professor from the Lewis School of Government, Rome. So today's discussion will focus on the G7's role in the multilateral world. With the GeoStrata's unique paradigm of intellect and wisdom, we present a question of how the G7 resonates with the contemporary intellectual discourse across the far reaches of the globe. So therefore, I would like to come up with a common question. How do you think India can work with the G7 on shared Indo-Pacific security issues? I would come to Dr. Ranade.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Anirban. First of all, thank you at the outset for inviting me on this very interesting roundtable. Also, I was going through your work, the GeoStrata, and want to commend you've been doing real good stuff and some serious IR-related work. So, kudos for you guys. I'll sort of, with my opening remark, I want to sort of begin with how does India situate G7 into its broader strategic calculus. And I am a student of international relations, so I focus primarily on security and strategic issues, and therefore I will sort of limit myself to those aspects. But my core focus in the time that is given to me is to sort of understand how India uses or looks at G7 for its own foreign policy objectives. And for the sake of convenience, I'll sort of try to sort of understand it in a way by characterizing its normative aspects, the more material and strategic aspects, and then there's certain aspirational connotation to what India hopes to achieve through G7. And interestingly, these align with most of it, if not all, align with the broader G7's agenda for its engagement with the global affairs, and therefore I think there's a bright future insofar as this association is concerned. Obviously, there are quite a few friction points, but I think so far both the G7 as a group and India has been able to sort of manage those. But insofar as the first component which I want to sort of focus on is the normative aspect of India's projection through G7 is where I want to sort of draw your attention, and I want to submit this for your consideration that India is sort of trying to project itself as a major power, notwithstanding its engagement with G7, but generally it's want to project itself as a major power, as a country which is ready to shoulder global responsibilities, and in a way that was expected of India for a long time, but there was some hesitation. But I think that hesitation has been crossed. However, there is a caveat here that while India wants to engage with the West primarily in managing certain global affairs, but it wants to do with an approach and sensitivities which satisfy Indian interests. So while it wants to be a major power, it wants to be a major power to shoulder the responsibility in its own standing. So its approach is not conforming to what may be considered as the Western approach. It wants to have its own way in dealing with things, but it can engage and negotiate with the world and find certain common grounds. And I think G7 is one of the very interesting forums through which India wants to project that normative standing. Remember, one of the very critical indicators of a major power is it sort of takes the role of a norm builder. It's not just a taker, but it's a norm builder. And I think G7 again is a very interesting forum through which India is trying to show that it can engage constructively in building norms and sustaining certain very important norms. For instance, law-based international order, human rights, democracy. All these are ideas which are very core to Indian sensitivities. In its own way, it deals with those issues, may not always necessarily conform to what the West's idea is, but is trying to sort of negotiate those ideas and project India in its own right as a major power, which can lead countries in its own right. It is also a very showing a very distinct place at G7. Remember, it's in a unique position which can be a member of an HCO, is a member of the BRICS, and at the same time can also deal with G7 member states. sometimes when the fault lines are too sharp, these some of these member countries may not always see eye to eye. But India is one country which can very comfortably navigate all these spaces. This is again something which is very unique, and the way India is saying that it is a power, something which West needs as well. Obviously, India needs G7 as much as G7 needs India, and therefore it is a country which says that it's now a major power. For long, it was India was called as an emerging power after it tested its nuclear weapon and was moving towards a new direction. But now it has arrived at the center stage, and G7 is a way, a forum, or a vehicle through which it wants to carry that norm as well. Sort of, so a normative angle obviously has its own place, but there are very core strategic material interests that India sort of sees within G7, and which is something which aligns with the G7's broader agenda, which makes it sort of a mutually conducive relationship. And obviously, one of the most important aspect of it is the commitment to the global based order, which is rule based and something which respects international law. All G7 members have said in unison that this has been one of their core agendas. Interestingly, G7 countries, at least in recent summits in 2021, 2022, later on as well, has voiced this concern more openly, at times being very consistently talking about an assertive China in the Indo-Pacific, something which again resonates with India. So that is a very core strategic interest for India, and I think India wants to be part of that forum in a way that could shape the ideas and issues in Indo-Pacific generally, but also in the broader global context. Something again which is a very strong strategic concern for India. G7 again, now India is obviously not a permanent, though there are certain murmurs, people talk about it. It might as well be a G8 with India being a permanent, who knows? But it is at least a permanent guest right now. This is, I think, 11th time that India was part of G7 summit in Italy. This time, Prime Minister Modi himself has been fifth, is visited fifth time this time. So, in a sense, India has almost become a permanent guest of sorts, representing the global south in a way in that forum. But it also becomes a very important forum to engage bilaterally with a lot of countries, and we have seen that happening quite often. And Italy is a very good example. We have crossed a lot of, we've actually traveled a lot of distance to come here between India and Italy. There were certain friction points earlier, but I think India-Italy is now sharing a very good rapport, and hopefully that is going to move towards a more strategic partnership. We already have a very strong strategic partnership with some of the other countries, whether it is France, UK, Japan. So I think it becomes a very interesting forum through which India is sort of using that to entrench that strategic partnerships even further, and which then can be sort of used for its other engagement in other multilateral forums, whether it could be multilateral forums in ASEAN or whether it could be multilateral forum elsewhere. For instance, Africa this time was a very interesting point. It was a very strong focus of the recently held G summit, and India has been focusing on Africa for a while now, realizes the potential and also the global competition that is happening around Africa. So if India can engage with a lot of players for that region, G7 is a good forum to do that. So India is also using or has a potential to use G7 as a forum to engage with the broader spectrum of issues through these countries as well. Uh,
So,
Apparently,
sir, in brief,
yeah,
India is basically trying to bolster its capabilities, especially with regard to global relations. And in G7 is actually currently playing a role in this regard with addressing India's current Indo-Pacific security challenges and issues. And also at the same time, India is also playing its role as a strategic autonomy and since the days of the NAM. So this is
yeah.
actually a policy continuation from the from the previous as well. So I'll come down to Dr. Sweta Kumari. How do you think that India can navigate, especially with its policy of strategic autonomy, navigate and engage with G7, especially to address its security concerns in the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you, Anirban and Team GeoStrata. It's a pleasure being here. And most of the things that I intended as my introduction has already been addressed by Dr. Ranade. So now I'm struggling for my introductory lines. Uh, so I would, before going to your question, I'll go a little back in the history of G7. So it started in the late 1970s, when there was a shock in global economy, and there was this oil crisis in the Arab world. And this, for the first time, brought the developed, advanced countries together to discuss the issues, economic, and later on uh, the strategic and security issues were imbibed in the grouping. Now, coming to the present time. So right now, and later on, Canada joined, and for the first time, Japan joined as first country from Asia, because the because of the convergence of interest. Now, coming to India, right now, the strategic interest of G7 and India, they align together. And that is what the key factor that brings India closer to G7. And as Mr. Dr. Ranade said, that India, this is the fifth time that Prime Minister Modi was invited there. So India is being treated as a key member, a key guest member, because India holds a lot of relevance in geopolitics right now, in terms of the threat from China, both economic as well as uh, security wise. The aggressive rise of China affects many of the prime partners of or allies of G7 countries and United States in the region, be it Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, the tensions across Taiwan Strait. So that is something that directly impacts the West and their engagement with China. Secondly, in terms of economy post pandemic, and then followed by Russia-Ukraine war, has led to economic distress across the world, triggering the earlier we heard about. So in a way, G7, we can say it is a kind of forecast of what is trending in the international domain. So so if you go back 2 3 years from now, there was talk about decoupling from China, then de-risking. Now this time we are hearing about overcapacity. So uh, to understand, in a way, G7 also tells us that what will be the trend of international relations and geopolitical ties that will follow uh, I mean, the currents of uh, international relations in the coming year, until and unless something pops up. Like last year, the conflict in Gaza, that becomes a pivotal point. So similarly, what happened in Russia, Ukraine. So these geopolitical developments and how these major powers think about it, how they deliberate it, and how they can engage with like-minded partners in the region. Uh, uh, in Indo-Pacific, especially, India comes into the picture because India is the only country in the region in terms of size and in terms of military capacity that can uh, counter or at least balance China. So that is something that has led the US and US led West's interest towards India and the Indo Pacific region. A strong India in itself is a strong deterrence to China. And it's not that just India needs the G7. The G7 needs India because of the sea lines of communication. So the major trade routes, they pass across the Indian Ocean. And the vulnerability of these global supply chains. So what happened in across Red Sea few months back, when there was attack by Houthis and all, it was Indian Navy that came to the rescue. So India is becoming very important even for the G7 countries. So we need them, they need us. And what makes India, as you asked about strategic autonomy, so India in a way is following what the experts are calling it practical pragmatism. So India is engaging with the West, but it has not severed its ties with Russia. It has made it very clear, and it has Indian government needs to be credited that the way they have managed the Russia-Ukraine crisis, along with uh, what is what is in interests of India. And India is also advocating as the voice of the global South. So in this G7, PM Meloni, she said that we will never accept the narrative that wants West against the rest. And India is something that connects West with the rest. Japan is something that has a uh, ambivalent identity. Sometimes it is an Eastern country. Sometimes it resembles the West. But India is something that can act as a bridge of global South. And if we look at last year's G7, when Japan was hosting the G7 and India was the holding the presidency of G20, at that point in time, PM Kishida, he was pushing for this inclusion of the idea of a secure and free and open Indo-Pacific. So he was pushing very hard that this agenda should be included in G7, and how what is happening in Russia-Ukraine could trigger as similarly in East Asia or across South China Sea. And something can, and also it also highlighted the ties between Russia and China post Russia-Ukraine war. So, uh, and also Japan was pushing for economic security, which it did this year as well. So, in that ways, Japan is trying to connect the issue of Indo-Pacific, the economic security or the military security or the aggressive. It is trying to highlight that how it impacts the global community. And there India comes into the picture. India talks about voice of the global South. India talks about inclusion of the global South. India talks about the crisis that has been triggered because of the war that is happening in Europe, and how it has impacted food, fuel, and fertilizers, and how this, in a way, is a national security to many of the countries in global South, where majority of the population is below poverty line. So in that ways, India is pushing the voice of the global South. It is emerging as a reliable security enabler in the region of sea lines of communication, at least across the Indian Ocean region. And at the same time, it is also emerging because of this economic crisis triggered by pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war. India is also being seen as a destination of uh, investment, because many countries are now seriously thinking about diversifying the global supply chains and shifting their manufacturing centers from China. So even if there is now decoupling is no more used in the narrative, but gradually the countries are trying to diversify, and they are looking for destinations where they can invest, and India is one of the most favorable destination. So so it's mutual, and it's the convergence of the interests of uh, West-led G7, US-led G7, and India. And at the same time, India has also uh, very firmly, without it has not participated. It has clearly mentioned that it's not India's war, Russia-Ukraine war, but at the same time, it has not supported Russia. It has Prime Minister Modi has said And in fact, right now, also he has, in his visit to Russia, he has talked about, he has advocated for giving dialogue and diplomacy a chance to end the war. So in a way, India is, what is in India's capacity, India is doing its best to participate in these geopolitical events, and at the same time project its foreign policy priorities and national interest. So I'll end here.
Yeah, so it is a very interesting take that you gave about G7, about the importance of India. Especially, my question was related to India's strategic autonomy at that particular point of time, and it very well addressed the relationship between India and G7, especially in the current scenario. But the current scenario in the global economy is actually marked by multiple players, as scholars of international politics and practitioners call it multilateralism. So, under this context, like, how do you think G7 and G20 relations can play an important role, especially in redefining G7 structure when the other non-G7 countries are growing, like China at a very speedy rate and India? So this particular question is directed to Dr. Raffaele Marchetti, especially how do you see G7's role evolving in the current sense?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the discussion so far. My opinion is pretty much on the negative. I do think that the level of collaboration between the G7 and G20 is not bound to increase. In fact, unfortunately, we observe a stark repolarization phase in global affairs. More and more, we see bifurcation, we see polarization, we see division into different camps, and this is not going to help the G7 G20 relations. The G7 was launched, or at least the head of government's G7 was launched in 2008. That was a moment in which the West entered into a crisis, first the US and then the EU. It was a financial, economic, later on political crisis. And at that time, the West needed the support and the inclusion of the new re-emerging economies. There was a kind of expectation that things could be handled in an inclusive and cooperative way. But in fact, things went precisely the opposite way. From 2008, we have seen a very stark divergence between especially US and China, and then US and Russia on different issues, economic issues, political issues, military issues, financial issues. So the G20 year by year lost its centrality because the split and the cleavage between the West and the other countries increased. Now, this is less visible when the G20 is chaired by a democratic country like India, like Brazil, like others. Obviously, it is definitely more visible when is chaired by a non-democratic countries. In fact, the role that India is trying to play, and it's like a bridge, and the previous speakers mentioned this strategic positioning of India, I mean, being able to talk to the West, but also keeping its relation with Russia, and somehow also with China, if we think about the BRICS collaborations so far and so on. This is a very difficult position, because if we reckon this polarization phase in global affairs, there is a tremendous pressure to align with one or the other camp. Now, remaining in the middle, trying to create a bridge, trying to play the honest broker role, it's not something easy to manage and to sustain in the long term. I understand this is a traditional positioning of India in global affairs. I understand India has its pride of being an important player in international affairs, but there are dynamics and moves that are larger than any single country. And unfortunately, these dynamics push toward choosing a camp. I mean, joining one or the other. Of course, India is in a good relation somehow with the US because of this regional competition with China. But at the same time, and there is this difficult issue with Pakistan that is also traditional allies of the US. Then there is the relation with Russia, which of course is very controversial from an US perspective. It's in an inherently difficult position that can be handled for the time being, but I suppose at some point, I mean, it requires a lot of careful and skillful diplomatic sort of maneuvering, but at the same time, there are certain issues that ultimately will demand a decision. I'm talking about high-level technology. I'm talking about military issues. I'm talking about security and intelligence issues. There is a point in which being, I mean, in both camps is not allowed anymore. So this is my perception about the general global trends. And that has implication, as I was trying to suggest, both for the G7, G20 cooperation, which I think has not a rosy perspective for the future. I mean, it will be not so significant because the G20 will be inherently installed because of this split between, let's say, the G7 or Western countries and the other countries. These global trends, of course, will also have a specific impact on a number of countries that try to play the kind of intermediary role, like India, like, for instance, Gulf countries, Emirates, United Emirates, and others, trying to sort of talk to both fields. This is a very risky strategy, and a strategy that I think will not be sustainable in the long term. Thank you.
So that was a very interesting take by you, especially when you consider camp politics, multipolarism. In this sense, especially if we talk from the prism of realist politics, in that sense, multilateralism and especially cooperation amongst various nations doesn't feature a very big role in this particular school of thought. So I'd come to Dr. Ranade once again to understand India's foreign and defense objectives, and how do you think that the G7 can shape its efforts in the Indo-Pacific region, and how and what its attempts will have its implications over India's foreign and defense objectives in the area?
Sure. I just want to sort of take the cue from where I think Dr. Raffaele left, in the sense that, it's not that India is trying to be a bridge. That's not the objective. That becomes one of the ways through which that relationship is viewed into. But what India's objective is that it wants to stick to its own interests, and those interests can be pursued. In the process, it can emerge as a bridge. So being a bridge is not the objective. It's the utility that can be seen by other players as well, and that sort of links to the Indo-Pacific question as well. In fact, just an anecdote. I mean, there was a lot of in 2023 at least, we saw there was a rise in Europe importing oil from India, which obviously we know that it has come from Russia and then it has gone to Europe. So it emerged as a bridge, which was then utilized by other countries as well. But that is not the objective. It's the position of India that becomes sustainable to become a bridge eventually. But coming to Indo-Pacific, aspect of it. I think, like I said in the opening part, that the vision for Indo-Pacific that India has and the G7's vision for Indo-Pacific largely coincides. Though the geographic contours are different, but the vision largely coincides. And more importantly, though India doesn't want it to emerge as a hard military bloc, but the interest, like this, Dr. Kumari mentioned about the salient of communication, the choke points, which are the lifelines of the global trade. India is, through its navy, at least in the Indian Ocean region, has been playing a very active role to safeguard those locks, and is interested in sort of taking that role ahead as well. And I think it's much in the interest of the other G7 countries as well. So that is one very strong line of convergence. We already have very good naval. Indeed, with the bilaterally, we have very strong naval cooperation. There are sea exercises with France, with US, with United Kingdom, Japan. Of course, Quad is one of the forums, though Australia is not part of G7. But this bilaterally, and also then sort of going into multilateralism. I think India can pursue that robust mechanism through which, at one level, the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific is sort of entrenched and emphasized, and another level through bilaterals and other multilaterals, India can pursue its defense as well as foreign policy objectives. And I think third, which sort of overlaps into both of them, is to strengthen the regional multilateral forums, essentially like ASEAN. Remember, ASEAN centrality has been key for India's foreign policy objective in the Indo-Pacific, and I think sort of ensuring that centrality, or generally strengthening the multilateral forums there, in order to ensure that it remains a multipolar region as well and is not dominated by a country, is again a very strong objective. And I think G7 has a very strong play in that. So I think in that sense also G7 may not directly, but becomes a good forum to sort of negotiate these ideas as well.
Yeah, that was a very interesting take that have made so far, especially when we consider G7 strategic relations and the risk factors that features in this particular juncture. So when we talk about the risk factors, it is inbuilt with non-traditional security threats. If we consider the aspect of healthcare, if we consider the aspect of global supply chains, all of these features into the realm of non-traditional security threats. So this time, my question will be directed to Dr. Sweta Kumari. How do you think that G7 can play a role in integrative health practices as a part of comprehensive approach towards healthcare? And because it has already learned lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, and how do you think this will help India in the longer run?
Thank you, Anupam. So it's been just 2 years that we have just come out of a very devastating global pandemic. And G7 has laid out some of the roadmap that how we can be better prepared in case of any kind of health emergencies, of it in any kind of pandemic like issue, or if and there has been this year's health ministers meeting in G7. So it was highlighted that there is a need to tackle the gap across the full cycle of prevention, and then preparedness and response to health emergencies. So India last year as well, India pushed for what we call use of technology and also digital platform in terms of making healthcare more accessible, more affordable, and more it could enhance the quality when it reaches out to remote areas or some underdeveloped areas, or to some underdeveloped nations. When it comes to complementary and integrative health approach, so integrative health approach is basically the coordination of the best practices of the conventional healthcare system, that is the Western medicine, and at the same time using the complementary healthcare practices that can work in a coordinated way to enhance the healthcare system. So after the first wave of coronavirus in 2020, the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention, it came out with a report which said that people with pre-existing conditions such as diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and all, they had 12 times more. The contraction rate was 12 times higher than people who did not have these pre-existing conditions. And right now we are facing a kind of global crisis in terms of chronic diseases, lifestyle-based diseases, and also mental illness. And all these add up in case of any kind of global pandemic. These add up the mortality rate and also long-term complications to the survivors. So it is very important to have a holistic understanding of healthcare where there is the concept of physical, mental, and overall spiritual well-being as well. So now even WHO talks about not just absence of disease, but a holistic approach, a holistic well-being of healthcare. And in that ways, India has played a very important role in terms of declaring, in terms for pushing for International Day of Yoga, which was one of the most prior foreign policy priorities of this government when it came to power in 2014. And it got overwhelming support of 177 countries to pass the resolution, because now practices like yoga, meditation, and natural medicine, it is gaining a lot of traction globally. And according to US National Health Interview Survey, yoga and meditation are in terms of complementary medicine, these have the highest popularity rate in the US, and it is growing year by year. And more research, evidence-based research, are establishing the benefits of yoga meditation that have originated in India. So India, in a way, has presented yoga, which is copyright-free and which is accessible to all. So through all these, so India needs to take a lead on this to in generating the narrative of a holistic healthcare, in which there is the preventive aspect is focused, and also in terms of dealing with mental health issues and PTSDs, defense. The Department of Veteran Affairs in US, it is applying a whole health program now for the veterans who have come back from combat and they go through stress and PTSDs and all. So we need to build a holistic healthcare narrative, and India has a big role to play. And our Prime Minister is already pushing for the idea of yoga economy and yoga tourism. And it is also they are creating awareness about through Namaste Yoga app and also certification board and everything. So they are trying to first of all have the authentic information, authentic channel routes, and India is emerging as a health tourism spot. So India, through these complementary and integrative health approaches, and India can build a holistic healthcare narrative when we live in times where we just had a very devastating global pandemic.
So basically, you also talked about the importance of health, and how we can increase health diplomacy, especially in this respect. There was also talk by you, especially in the 1973 oil crisis. You have made reference to it in your opening statement. Health and cooperation and other shortcomings of the international system can only be achieved after we achieve a certain degree of political clarity, as well as we can achieve a political cooperation between various regions across the world. So this particular question, I'll come down to Dr. Raffaele Marchetti. From the beginning of the G7, we have seen that its origins has gone back to the 1973 oil crisis and shortcomings of the international system. How do you think that the G7 can reform itself to achieve a degree of political cooperation in various regions, not only to mitigate risk factors coming with health and other associated emerging technologies, but also to make sure that it can have a significant degree of political unity among the countries among the countries that are part of this particular specific bloc?
Well, there are two strategies that have been pursued in different historical periods by the at the beginning G5 and then 6, 7, 8, and then now back to 7 after Russia was put out of the gatherings. These two strategies are, on the one hand, to increase the number, to admit new members. This happened from G5, we went to G8, now G7. There are currently countries who would like to join the G7. South Korea is one of them. They would like to some extent, be more integrated up to become a member of that, and maybe other countries in the world. So there is one issue about one strategy to increase the dialogue and the cooperation with others is simply to enlarge the membership. The second strategy is to increase the cooperation in an informal way. This is pursued through, for instance, ad hoc invitation to the different G7 summits. This also happened in the last case, which was chaired by Italy. A number of leaders from non-G7 countries were invited, including, of course, India, Brazil, and many others, a number of African countries. And this is another way to create a dialogue and to perhaps enhance cooperation, to find common grounds, common interest. But as I said, I mean, this is always within a kind of a view that, let's say, to enlarge the camp of a certain like-minded countries that can cooperate in ultimately a competition with the other camp. So these invitations are instrumental to the pursuit of those goals and are constrained or conditional on the sharing of a certain set of values. So they can do something, they can achieve some goals, but of course, I mean, we shouldn't be naive in thinking that this is a green field in which everything is possible. Unfortunately not. But I see these two strategies used at times. It is, in fact, has been quite a long time that the G something has not increased. In fact, it decreased. It went down from G8 to G7, kicking out Russia. But who knows? Maybe in the future there will be new members joining the G7, and that at that time will become G8, 9, or 10. Who knows? In fact, there is a bit of a competition there. There might be a competition of attraction between the so-called BRICS, that is enlarging its membership, and the G7. Thank you.
So you talked about the importance of G7 and how India can navigate around it, and what's the competition behind it, especially if we consider the two rival blocks of G7, G20, and BRICS. As per that, I can understand the worldview of yours. You were understanding it with competition. You were understanding with contentions and contradictions. So if we talk about the contradictions and contentions, it is very important that we look up into the domestic governance systems of specific countries as well. My questions will now be directed to Dr. Ranade. So given the India's monetary and legislative setup, how do you think that the India can team up with G7, especially when we talk about the clean power shift, energy efficiency, and aspects with regard to sustainable development as well?
Yeah, right. So one of the things here, like this is one of the issues where there are certain, obviously the broader agenda is same, but there are the way to approach a broader agenda is at times India differs from the way the West wants to go ahead. But there is a lot, there is a potential for a lot of synergy there as well. I mean, Individually, obviously, there are clean energy or shift to clean energy is something which is sought after, and one of the areas where I think there could be a collaboration that can happen is a joint R&D and certain collaboration through which there could be technology transfer as well. I think individual at the bilateral level that is being sought by India through various partners, but I think there is certain more synergy in that. I think that can be very well pursued. International Solar Alliance, for instance, is a good way through which India sought to achieve certain multilateral energies towards a common goal, and I think that is something which can be a model through which multilateral efforts can also be achieved at. I mean, the other way in which, I mean, there is a lot of buzz around scholarships. There is a lot of way through which scientists are. I mean, in Quad there was certain way to do that. I think some academic scholarships which then can be translated into certain commercial endeavors. Because remember, all said and done, there is a strong commercial angle to it. Whether it is R&D, whether it is technology transfer, there's going to be certain commercial angle, and it's not going to be easy to track it down. So, and essentially, when there is a market attached to it, it's not always that easy. So I think this is a tricky point. And essentially, the legal setup, you talked about the legal setup in India. At times, there's a lot of complaint that it is uncertain. At times there is retrospective ways to look into it. So I think at that end there is a lot of work and understanding that needs to be done. But given the way some of the multilateral initiatives are trying to map it out, I think that is possible. So I think there is some tricky points and tricky issues here. But if through technology transfer and identifying and sorting out the commercial issues there, probably could help achieve that objective as well.
Yeah, so when we were talking about multilateralism, defense, and foreign policy, especially when we talk about this, but all this also brings the importance of space capabilities. And since India is already a spacefaring nation right now, we should take into consideration of G7 space policies as well. So my question will now be directed to Dr. Sweta Kumari. How do you think that the G7 space policies and initiatives can intersect with India's growing space capabilities in this regard, especially when we talk about the weaponizations of space and when we consider our policies with regard to defense and security?
So India is one of the leading spacefaring nation. So in terms of ASAT capabilities, in 2009, India launched the Mission Shakti, where the India fired an ASAT missile in outer space in its lower orbit. India has been part of the multilateral space policy since its beginning, and India has been partners to most of the space um, uh, in terms of outer space treaty and other mechanisms in terms of multilateral space programs. India, at the same time, last year it became a member to Artemis Accord, which is a US-led another kind of multilateral space grouping outside the ambit of UN. And at the same time, India has developed significant capabilities in terms of its civilian programs, be it Mangalyaan, Mission Mangalyaan, or recent Chandrayaan 2. So in that ways, India is also being seen as and a kind of what do we it helped the neighboring countries in terms of INSAT programs and all. So India, in a way, again, it works as a line of connection, a bridge between the advanced countries and the global south. So again, in this domain as well, India aspires to be in because now India has substantial asset in the International Space Station, and uh, it the kind of capabilities that China has, be it kinetic kill or be it jamming and spoofing, it can substantially impact India's space infrastructure. So India needs to be aligned with the advanced countries, which is reflected in G7, so that it can protect the asset, its own asset, and also India can work in building a more inclusive norms in terms of outer space domain. And it can also, again, it can also be a voice of global south, who also need these assistance in terms of their digital infrastructure, their cyber domain, and everything. And at the same time, India can be a force which can help or contribute in building these space norms, which are more inclusive in nature and less discriminatory for the global south.
So you talked about less discriminatory space policies, as well as I think this is a clarion call for an equitable world order, which India and especially the ideal school of thought actually sees. But however, the current world system is not so. Especially when we see G7 as a group, which is mainly considered as an alternate source of European representation in world affairs. We can see that the European Union has been adequately represented in almost all the organizational structure, especially in G7. So this particular question is directed to Dr. Raffaele Marchetti, which is actually not related to any of the previous questions that we have asked so far. How do you think that given the current organizational structure, that G7 can leverage its institutions of EU 27 member states to encourage dialogue and discussions in various sectors like health, climate, and especially problems like debt restructuring, along with the global governance institutions like the United Nations?
Thank you. Well, first of all, we should not make a mistake. The G7, the leading force in the G7 is the US. Okay, it's a US-led organization. So, well, there are a number of European countries. The EU is invited as a kind of participant member. But obviously, the leading force and power is the US. There is a certain representation of European countries. Of course, not all European countries are part of the EU. I mean, you know very well that Great Britain, post-Brexit, is not anymore part of the EU. So in fact, there are only 3 countries that are part of the European Union there, out of 7, that is France, Germany, and Italy. So in fact, the total amount of EU participation in the G7 is not so high. At the same time, of course, there is the representation of the EU as such, which brings a bit the interest of the European Union as such, and the interest of the whole, let's say, 27 members involved. So yes, it's an additional opportunity for the EU and the other members, of course, also small European member states that would not otherwise have a chance to have a voice in these gatherings, to indeed somehow participate, though indirectly, through the EU representations. So this is good. In fact, until I mean, the last EU elections, I mean, the EU was represented by one figure that was coming from Germany, another one from Belgium. Now, Germany is part of the G7 anyway, but Belgium not. Of course, Michel was representing the European Union, but at the same time, he was also coming from a fairly small country, which would gain access to this forum through the EU representation. So this is just an example to show how medium or small countries, European Union countries, can have access to these circuits. So it is an option, but as I said at the beginning, let's not make a mistake in thinking that G7 is a EU kind of window or EU voice. In fact, as I said, EU countries are a minority numerically, and also in terms of power. There is a strong American leadership into that.
So the points that have raised, the G7 should not be considered as only an European institution, considering its representations across the world and across various top economies of the world. So it also gives, since it is home to many of the top economies, and it's a grouping that has been considered a very quote unquote very posh grouping in the world economic systems and the world power systems as well. So this comes to the concerns of India, especially when we talk about South Asia. I'll come to Dr. Ranade right now. Like, what chances do you think India G7 partnership can play an important role, especially when we consider the safety problems and issues of security in the South Asian region?
Right. So I myself am skeptical as to what extent G7 can actually have much of say in the issues of South Asia. Something which is one of the things is that India has always said that it doesn't really encourage anyone outside. Means South Asia has been generally considered India's sphere of influence and doesn't really want any outside interference into the direct issues. If I'm talking about South Asia, primarily there is obviously the big issue is India Pakistan, which is a bilateral issue. There could be certain border issues that generally we face, but I don't see there is a direct connection that India would encourage within South Asia. Broadly speaking, yes. Let's say the issue of terrorism is there, and India has been sort of trying to voice that issue at the global stage. The 1996 Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, I think, is just obscure now. No one really remembers that. That's partly because UN itself is not something that people would look after for. But in such cases, I think India would sort of want to ensure that its own ideas and its own issues about terrorism are sort of resonated with the global community, and it could use forums like this to sort of raise those. Whether it is drug trafficking, something which sort of finances a lot of these terrorism-related issues, and not directly to India, but also to the rest of the world. If we sort of slightly extend it to Afghanistan, we know that it is going to be an issue which we are still looking how the Taliban regime actually pans out. India is also taking its sort of stances very cautiously, but we want a global sort of opinion around which India can rally as well. So I think, normatively speaking, yes, it can talk about illicit drug trafficking, counterfeit currency, terrorism, which generally will require certain sort of an international opinion. But talking about direct security and safety concerns, I don't think India would be very much sort of looking for some outside interference. Of course, if you want to sort of China issue is obviously different. Doesn't this? I won't call it a South Asian thing, but if particularly South Asia, I don't think G7 can directly participate, except for having certain credence to India's own norms there.
So right now I'd come up with a common question, because when we consider about de-risking economies, especially when we consider about the aspects of multilateralism, in the 50th G7 summit, which has been held in 2024, has actually enshrined the spirit of de-risking economies, especially with regard to many with the emergence of rival countries like China, is leading investment opportunities to many of the third nations as well. So this particular question will be directed to Sweta Kumari. How do you think that the G7 and its economies can realign its objectives, especially with regard to multinational enterprises and affiliates, with respect to China and with respect to other potential destabilizing factors in the world politics?
Can you please repeat your question? I think there was some network issue going on, so I couldn't hear it.
Yeah, so my question was basically focused on the emergence of potential rivals like China emerging in the world economic system, and they're driving economic investment opportunities. But in the current juncture, we can see that many of the investment opportunities has gone to third nations like India, Vietnam, especially when we consider the countries of the ASEAN nations as well. How do you think that has actually shifted the power dynamics, and what is the role of G7 in it?
Um, uh, as I was mentioning earlier, that post this economic crisis after the pandemic, and again triggered by Russia-Ukraine war. So this thing that the over dependency of manufacturing to China has been a problem, and now it has been set in motion. But again, the ties are still very strong with China. So, yes, it has been set in motion, diversification has been set in motion, but still a number of businesses of these countries are still invested in China. They are still dependent in China, be it the European countries. So we are actually witnessing a kind of uh, love-hate kind of relationship between uh, among these countries and China. So there is compulsion, there is still economic compulsions. For example, US uh, firms like Intel and IBM, they are heavily, their R&D is based on China. So I mean, uh, with the Inflation Reduction Act and everything, they are trying to shift these things to back to US. But again, that requires a great pool of funding, and that funding and that source of income still comes from China. So now uh, we see that, for example, Apple. Now we see that Apple is in a way has diversified to Vietnam or India uh, and everything, but it will take some time. And also, we don't know in which direction the Chinese economy is heading, because we internally we hear things that there is an economic crisis going on in terms of the property market, and there is a lot of youth unemployment rate is very high within China. So uh, what I can say from my perspective, that yes, diversification has been set in motion, and it will also be important. And the countries are now looking for different destination for investment, in which India has a place for. And they are diversifying not just to Southeast Asia or India. Bangladesh has become one of the in South Asia, it has become a preferred destination for manufacturing and all. So yes, the wheels have been set in motion, and I personally believe that in a couple of years we will see that there will be, in terms of fresh investments, there will be if for G7 countries and all, there will be third countries will be the preferred option, the preference will be in the third countries uh, outside China for investment. So uh, that's my analysis.
So, because many of the countries are moving outside of China with regard to that, but China still holds a prominent investment destinations for many of the European countries. I'd come to Dr. Raffaele Marchetti. Do you think that this particular system is changing with regard to China's behavior, and what will be the role of G7 economies in this regard?
Well, obviously, there is a pressure to reassess global value chains. The role of political risk analysis is increasing. There is a growing perception that value chains that are too stretched and too global might be risky. There is an assessment that there is a need to find a more reliable, like-minded partner to relocate some of the strategic manufacturing. This is very clear. This came clear with COVID, later on with the war in Ukraine, and in general with the repolarization phase of the global affairs. So there is a stronger, the need for reshaping value chains, international value chains, is very strong. Both in Europe and in the US and North America, there is a feeling that to the extent that is possible, strategic production needs to be located domestically, and if not, be located in countries that are near and friendly. Obviously, moving and relocating production, it's not easy. So this is taken by degrees, and it will also take some time. But clearly there is an opportunity. I mean, for instance, a country that is benefiting a lot out of this increased risk perception on China is Mexico. A number of American companies have relocated to Mexico because it's near, it's more or less like-minded. And so there is, in fact, a significant move in value chains, and we need to observe this. But one issue is clear, that the kind of delocalization that we have witnessed in the 90s, which were totally blind to political risk, that time has gone. Now there is a wider and deeper acknowledgement of political risk related to global value chains. Thank you.
So we are almost at the end of the discussion session. So I would come for the closing statement to Dr. Ranade. So with regard to G7's restructuring and with regard to the emergence of many other nations with its investment destinations mainly in China, what are the key takeaways for India with related to this current development and to the current crisis that is unfolding, especially in the Indo-Pacific region? Your last statements.
Yeah, so I think it falls to something that we've been discussing for a while, that the key takeaways is, I think the first thing is something that India will be conscious of, and I think would want the rest of the world to be conscious of, is that the states are going to be, it doesn't want to fall in the trap of being in a bipolar world. I think that discussions is archaic insofar as India's foreign policy discussion is concerned. So India would sort of want to be seen as, so this is where the aspirational part of India's foreign policy coming. It says that it wants a multipolar world, and India is one of the poles. It is too early to say that militarily and materially. I think we may not be a pole yet, but that is an aspirational reality which India wants to project. And if you see, the deliberations have been on those lines. One of the key takeaways would be that there are going to be contestations. There are going to be issues when India and the countries in the G7 or in the broader West are not going to see eye to eye, or something that we have seen in G7 also, when Biden was talking about a unity insofar as Russia-Ukraine was concerned. G20 was another issue when that fall time came in, and India wanted to navigate its space around that. So one of the key takeaways would be that India wants to see a sense of multipolarity emerging, where India will have a space to navigate its own strategic outlook the way India wants to sort of drive it. India wants to quote it. And the other takeaway would be that there are going to be strong ways in which the convergences could push some of these forums ahead. There are a lot of areas of convergences, value chains which is talked about, Indo-Pacific, the salience of communications, the non-traditional security threats, and also the global balance of power, which is right now in flux because of the rise of China and its assertiveness, and the ongoing equation between Russia and China is going to push the balance of power further in flux. So in order to maintain that balance, I think there's need to have a broader synergy between the ideas as well as the material capabilities of different states. And I think that is when there is a lot of areas of convergences. As long as we work on convergences, I think there's a good way ahead. But whenever there are contestations, I think that needs to be managed. And so far, I think all states have known that these contestations will have to be managed, and I think fairly everyone understand that. So I think if we could manage both of these things well, it's going to be a better future.
So we are almost at the end of the session right now. So I thank all the panelists who have arrived into this particular panel discussion, especially when we talk about the G7's role and its synergy for a multilateral world. So in this particular sessions, we have talked about the importance of foreign policy. We have talked about the importance of investments. We have also touched upon the distant facets like space security and weaponizations as well. Apart from that, we also have talked with regard to trade relations as well, and its importance with regard to global value chains. So I'd like to thank all the panelists and keep watching Geo interview, and it's where we actually have tried to integrate traditional and modern approaches to deal with all world politics and to come forward with the Indian view of world affairs. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.